August 1st, 2023. The French National Olympic and Sports Committee rules that FC Sochaux does not meet the financial requirements to stay in French football's second division, League 2. This upholds an earlier ruling that already said that Sochaux must dissolve and restart as an amateur club if it wishes to continue. The two-time French champions, the Coupe de France winners from as recently as 2007, were staring directly into the abyss. And yet this season, miraculously, the club plays on, 7th in the third division in France. Now, the first professional club to ever exist in France was not PSG or Marseille or Lyon. It was actually FC Sochaux Montbéliard. It was founded by two workers from the car company Peugeot, which was and still is the biggest employer in the area around Sochaux, which is here on a map, by the way. There's only 3,949 people there now, and it's right next to Montbéliard, which is here and has an extra 25,000. Soon after the workers started that club, the CEO of Peugeot himself decided to take on the project as a way to encourage physical activity amongst the workers. He also wanted to turn the club into a competitive one, and this is not the last time that the Peugeot family would step up in an hour of need for FC Sochaux. The Peugeot family took an active stance on professionalism, even admitting they were paying some of their players and that they used their factories to employ a lot of the players they were bringing to their clubs, even though professionalism was still frowned on in continental Europe. It was, of course, already taking hold in England, though. Now, the economic prospect of being offered a guaranteed job if you played for the team was able to attract a lot of talented players to FC Sochaux in its early history. It climbed the ranks of the amateur competitions and established a regional dominance, including over one of its neighbors, AS Montbéliard, which merged with FC Sochaux. That's why the club is fully called FC Sochaux Montbéliard. By 1932, the club was so successful it had several players in the national team, and it joined the inaugural French championship, and this was the beginning for a golden era for the small company town. It won 2 French championships and a Coupe de France, with this golden era only being ended by a little thing called World War II. And if you realize where Sochaux is by zooming that map out a little bit, you'll realize that, yeah, World War II was not a great time to be in Sochaux. Not that it was a great time to be anywhere. And after the war, Sochaux actually fell into a lull, but it always maintained its status as a team in one of the top 2 divisions of the French leagues. It didn't pursue success in the same way as other clubs by spending big on players, which is hugely ironic considering where this story is going, but it was dedicated at the time to the idea of a balanced budget. The result was that it had to develop its own players, and there was an ingenious way that Sochaux actually did this. FC Sochaux realized it already had a built-in scouting network to use to develop a youth academy, and that scouting system was the network of Peugeot factories across France, like the actual car factories. If a young player had promise and was in the Peugeot car factory network, they'd be offered a part-time job at the Peugeot factory in Sochaux, and then they would spend the rest of the time training with the team. It's an absolutely brilliant way to use what you already have to try and find young talented players, and I want it included in Football Manager so I can do that on stream. But alas, it is not. By 1974, Sochaux had established a proper academy that was developing very good youth talent. The full organization of the youth academy kicked Sochaux back into overdrive, and by 1980, it was finishing 2nd in all of France. And after that performance in 1981, it made the UEFA Cup semi-finals. That's the precursor to the Europa League, and it only lost by 1 to AZ from the Netherlands in that semi-final. These Sochaux teams were loaded. Their academy produced 4 different French internationals in the early 1980s: Bernard Giannini, Yannick Stopira, Joël Batz, and Philippe Anciani, all of whom were part of a French generation that won the 1984 European Championships. But I'm really just naming all of them so you could have a look at how fabulous and ferocious all of their hairstyles were. But after an all-time run by any youth academy anywhere, as football clubs go, they wax and wane, and Sochaux fell back into being a yo-yo club between the 1st and 2nd division in the early 90s. But in 1999, a new key figure in the history of the club would emerge. He was new club president Jean-Claude Plessis, and it was the fortitude of people like Plessis that are the only reason this club is still around at all. But in 1999, he was just taking charge of the club and trying to revitalize and reorganize the youth academy, which was the only way a club in a small town like Sochaux could compete. And as you can tell by the fact that we've already stopped to really point out Jean-Claude Plessis in the history of Sochaux, it worked really well. Sochaux became a regular in the top flight of France, League 1, once again, and by 2003 it had made the League Cup final, a competition that has since been discontinued. It's basically the Carabao Cup in France. The following year, Sochaux actually won the whole thing, its first major trophy since 1938. But the real prize of the Plessis era was 3 years later, and that was arguably the biggest prize in French football football, the often ridiculous Coupe de France, a tournament that includes an unbelievable number of teams, including those from French territories, from Réunion to French Guiana. And in 2007, Sochaux's incredibly talented bunch of players finally found its way into a Coupe de France final for the first time in an age. The only problem was they were matched up against a team from Marseille that included Franck Ribéry, Samir Nasri, and Djibril Cissé. And those problems were compounded by the fact that Cissé scored 5 minutes into the match to give Marseille a lead. But with almost 20 minutes to play, Mamouni Dagano headed home a sharp cross to level the score. I gotta say, he was pretty easy to find in the box there due to those incredible yellow uniforms that Sochaux was rocking. The goal forced extra time, but once again Marseille was able to pull away thanks to another goal from Djibril Cissé, who was actually on loan from Liverpool at the time. The goal was also scored on goalkeeper Teddy Richer, who I'm only pointing out because he has an uncanny resemblance to David Villa for some reason. Sochaux was able to come back for a second time though, with Anthony Latelec finishing off a beautiful lofted ball with a classy headed finish, and that produced penalties. The penalty shootout came down to Sochaux captain Jérémy Bréchet, who could win the cup with his penalty, but he actually missed. The blessing for Sochaux is that Marseille missed their next penalty, so Sochaux had another opportunity to win it, and they did win the Coupe de France for the first time since World War II. Well, before World War II. 70 years. An inaugural French club was finally back on top of the French game, but it was just 16 years before the fateful 2023 that would bring it all crashing down. But even with those ominous undertones, at least they looked very good in the cup final. And you too can look good with kits from Sangalo. Like this one from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And that's just the beginning of what you can get on Sangalo. It's a company that hooks up smaller clubs from around the world with people that like to collect more obscure jerseys. This one also comes in green, for example. Maybe a Senegalese club, Stade d'Embor, is more your style. How about Stallion Laguna from the Philippines? They're all officially sourced from the clubs, and the company is working with the clubs to help increase exposure for football all around the world. So if you want cool kits, check out the link in the description, and we thank them for sponsoring these videos. Now, unfortunately for Sochaux, the year after their Coupe de France victory, Jean-Claude Plessis decided to retire. He retired to Brittany and became the president of an amateur club up there. His retirement signaled a turn in fortune that saw Sochaux battling against relegation all of a sudden. In fact, since his retirement, Sochaux has finished inside the top 10 in League One just once, since 2008. The former European regulars were teetering by 2013, and they called upon one of football's magic men, Hervé Renard. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he was the coach of Saudi Arabia when they beat Argentina at the World Cup. In this instance, he was coming off leading Zambia to a win at the Africa Cup of Nations. The dude is a wizard, but not even he could save Sochaux. Under Renard's leadership, they were relegated in 2014 to the second tier. Groupe Peugeot, which was the official ownership group run by Peugeot, announced that it would be selling the club to help deal with financial issues at the actual parent company. The result was a new owner. And in 2015, LED US, a Chinese company that specialized in lighting, bought the club for 7 million euros. And the slide would continue. LED US was an uninspiring ownership group that produced seasons somewhere between 10th and 16th in the French second division for 5 straight years. This was compounded by the issue that China was disinvesting itself from football in general, so LED US was seeking out partners. They even partnered with the group that owns Alaves in Spain for a short while. And this increasingly desperate reaching finally got the attention of the DNCG, or the the National Directorate of Management Control. It's basically the thing that oversees the administration of professional football in France, not unlike the FFP, for example. Well, that started to poke around at Sochaux. And after that failed partnership with the ownership group from Alaves, this is the first time that DNCG actually threatened to relegate Sochaux based on financial grounds. In fact, Sochaux was only saved at this point because it made a couple of profitable player sales and got a solidarity fee for Marcus Thuram's move to Borussia Mönchengladbach. But Sochaux was now sitting on the cusp of relegation out of the second division, and LED US had had enough. They sold to another Chinese company called Nanking. And Nanking, to its credit, injected a lot of money to get DNCG off the club's tail, for now. And what makes this particularly painful is that Nanking's arrival actually caused a resurgence performance at Sochaux. By 2022, Sochaux had actually managed to make the promotion playoffs to try and get back to League One, only to lose in a penalty shootout to Adler, who then went into the final and won on a penalty shootout to get promoted to League One instead. So Adler received the fulfillment and the financial windfall that might have saved Sochaux. The next year, it got even more painful as another excellent season was derailed by 8 straight losses to end the season. To put that in perspective, last year after match day 30, Sochaux was at 52 points, third in the table, 4 points off of an automatic promotion, and very comfortably within the playoff picture. In match day 38, Sochaux was still on 52 points. It had fallen all the way to 9th in the table and missed the playoffs by 3 points. If one of those losses was a win, they would have been in the playoffs, but they weren't. And Ninking's aggressive spending was a gamble that did not pay off. So unless the owners wanted to spend heavily once again on Sochaux's budget, then it would run afoul of the DNCG. And it did, because the DNCG announced on June 28th that the budget did not meet its standard and the club would be relegated to National 1, the 3rd division in France, for the first time in its history. The irony is that this relegation, coming from a system that's designed to financially protect the game and those within it, was actually what was threatening Sochaux's existence the most. That's because the relegation caused Xiong Naisheng, the owner of the Nanking Group, to want to pull back from the club. And while that is a cruel move, it is at least understandable. The sports director Samuel Laurent estimated that it would take $22 million to satisfy the DNCG and keep Sochaux afloat. And that was enough to make Naisheng tap out. The result was a situation where, without a massive financial investment from the owner to at least meet National 1 standards, the club was at risk of being stripped of its professional status and forced to restart as an amateur team in the 5th division. It'd be like 1928 all over again, but the Peugeot car company is not walking through that door again. Or are they? The uncertainty of this offseason in the summer of 2023 meant 19 players left the club, most of the time for free, and 150 employees sat in limbo while they waited for the final hammer to fall along with all the fans. And the options were running out. On July 11th, the DNCG upheld its decision on appeal, and the Nanking Group announced that it would not support a team in National 1, which meant it was sell or fold. In a desperate attempt to keep the pillar of their local community in place, local authorities scrambled to negotiate with Nanking about what would be an appropriate sale price that would also satisfy the DNCG in National 1, and they settled on 12 million euros as that price. Now the issue is just finding somebody with 12 million euros. If this video does well, you never know. I think I only need like 80 billion views. But believe it or not, it actually wasn't me. It was somebody much cooler than that. Somebody descending from the heavens, emerging from the mists of time around the club. A grandson, or great-grandson that is, of Jean-Pierre Peugeot, Romain Peugeot. He announced he was bidding for the club and contacting investors to try and make it possible. That was necessary because the company itself was not in a position to take the club back on, so this was a purely personal venture for Romain Peugeot. Nonetheless, it was a beacon of hope suddenly for the employees, the players, the fans, to keep the idea of FC Sochaux alive, if just barely. While they couldn't get all the money together, Nanking and Peugeot hammered out an agreement where Romain Peugeot and his conglomerate of investors would take over 2/3 of the company. And by the end of negotiations, they believed they'd put together a good enough financial profile to actually stay in League 2. But when they took this proposal to the French National Olympic and Sports Committee for approval, it was denied on August 1st, allegedly because it just wasn't good enough. The numbers didn't add up. As much as it kept the hope of FC Sochaux alive, they did not have the money. And as a result, despite the great intentions, Romain Peugeot had to give up his bid to buy the club. But another figure from Sochaux's past was actually working on a solution. Enter the latest savior of the club, Jean-Claude Plessis, the former club president who miraculously pulled off a purchase of the club on August 10th under the condition that the DNCG would approve their status at least for National 1. So they weren't going for League 2 anymore, just National 1 to keep the club alive and professional. Even though it was less, Plessis obviously did not have that kind of money, but he used his gravitas to put together a consortium of over 40 local businesses, individual investors, including former coach Hervé Renard, and $3 million from the local authorities trying to invest in one of their local pillars. And at 79 years old, Jean-Claude Plessis had pooled enough money for what he called the last fight of his life. As for what drove the former legend to come back and help the club, it was actually the impassioned pleas of supporters that reached his ears and motivated him to make this move. A selfless act of absolutely cashing in every chip that you've accumulated over your entire life to try and save the club that you love. And whether it worked or not, would be decided on August 17th. One of the last chances for FC Sochaux, one of France's oldest clubs, to be saved. And on that date, the DNCG and the French National Olympic and Sports Committee approved the sale. They approved the numbers, and Sochaux, the oldest professional club in France, is now also the one that cheated death, beginning a journey to try and get back to where it once was, at the top of the French game. If you enjoyed this video, then please do subscribe. And if you want to read more about it, a lot of the sources, although they might be in French, you can translate them on, Chrome or whatever you happen to be using. All of those research resources are in the description, as well as the contact information for our researcher. His name is Thibaut, and he's very good at what he does. If you want to keep binge watching videos, this is when we took a trip to the Faroe Islands. Yes, you've probably not heard of them, but they are the home of the smallest club to make it to any European group stage ever, and we went to see how that club actually managed to do it. We spent a week there, and I ate fermented sheep, and it was fun. I enjoyed it. Sheep was interesting.